For the second video in this series, we're going to talk about surveys. So these are another piece of evidence that are included very often in argumentative writing, where, this many people out of 10 believe, in this. Sorry, terrible example, but you understand what I mean by surveys there. They can be very convincing. They can give us a great insight into certain truths, but you do want to make sure that you are asking yourself certain questions to make sure whether or not you are making the right conclusions from this data. The main thing to keep in mind is asking yourself who is being contacted or interviewed for these surveys. It's the number one question here. Is there equal representation in the people surveyed for this evidence, otherwise known as the sample? If there is, how does that change its reliability? If not, why not? What does the publisher of this data have to gain by not having equal representation? What implicit biases could have led to this exclusion? Basically, is there a benefit to not having equal representation for the people conducting the survey? Is this going to help them get the answer that they want rather than maybe the most accurate one? From How to Lie with Statistics, the author has a great quote that I think is really important, so I'd put it here. And he said, even if you can't find a source of demonstrable bias, allow yourself some degree of skepticism about the results. As long as there is a possibility of bias somewhere, there always is. Okay. So again, not saying that you can never trust a survey, but just understand that there will always be some sort of bias there, especially in True Enough. They go into great detail about exit polls and the biases that can happen there in terms of, who people go up to ask questions. So just always keep that in mind. While we're talking about samples for surveys, it's important that you have some familiarity with what type of sample. The most common is a random sample. This is where it's really, theoretically at least, just up to chance who is selected. However, this method of collecting survey samples is very difficult and expensive. It's hard to generate all these names and make sure that they're random, and it is expensive to follow up with such a large group of people, which has led a lot of surveys to instead take on this slightly different model called stratified random sampling. This is seen typically as the next best alternative, where you identify the different groups you want to be equally represented in the results, and then you have random sampling within each of those groups. So it's not quite as, up to chance as a random sample, but it's almost like you're controlling it to make sure that it is equal. Another important thing to keep in mind, another great quote from How to Lie with Statistics, is just understanding where the bias tends to skew. So always keeping in mind that this is where our samples tend to move towards. The author writes that bias in polls skewed toward the person with more money, more education, more information and alertness, better appearance, more conventional behavior, and more settled habits. So this is the type of person that is typically more commonly approached in polls, right, for a variety of reasons. Again, it could be something that you do unconsciously, not to say that every poll taker is, a bigot or biased or anything. But for example, if there's somebody who comes up on the street talking to themselves, you're probably less likely to ask them to engage in a poll than somebody who is not talking to themselves, right? So then we see the bias towards people with more conventional behavior and more settled habits. Along with considering who is being contacted or interviewed, you want to think about that group of people and how that could impact their own responses to the survey. So is there any reason why people interviewed may not be entirely truthful in response to the survey questions? Is there some sort of embarrassing element to one of the survey responses where people might not want to share that out loud with a stranger? Is there some sort of moral value attached to one of the responses where people will want to make sure that they come across as an upstanding citizen? You want to keep these things in mind. Then ask yourself how that could have skewed the data. Again, is there anything at risk in being entirely truthful, at risk for the people answering the survey questions? And are there better ways to phrase the survey question to encourage honesty? You also want to ask yourself how the survey was administered. So was this randomly calling people on the phone? Was this an email survey? Was it sent out in the mail where you need to mail back your responses? And how might that change the responses, right? Who is most likely to pick up a phone call in the middle of the day? And how can that change the sample size you're talking to? Who is more likely to respond to an online survey? And how does that change the demographic you're talking to? Who is most likely to take the time to fill out something by mail and mail it back in? These all change who is being represented in the survey. Even if you have a completely equal sample size, completely random, accounts for all different demographics with age, race, gender, everything, if only certain people respond, you're not really getting a random sample back with your responses. You also want to think about who is asking the questions. So when it's being administered, perhaps over the phone, right? Is it somebody who's younger talking to somebody who's older? How could that change the responses? Vice versa. If it's a survey of just people walking around a city, how does that change it based on who's asking the questions? How many people were surveyed, and how does that potentially change the percentages, right? Saying 50% of people is very different if you've surveyed 10 people and only 5 agree with the position. That's very different than 50% where you surveyed 1,000 people and 500 have that position. And again, who is likely to take the time to respond to the survey? And how might that skew the results? These are all great questions to keep in mind when you're given data in a piece of argumentative writing that has to do with surveys. Keep listening in our series to talk about the sources